Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. Under the shadow of US tariff policies, the three-day G7 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting in the small Canadian town of Banff has come to a hasty end. According to a comprehensive analysis by the Mainland's Observer Network, President Trump's tariff offensive has continuously intensified divisions among allies, and related issues have also been widely regarded as the main focus of this meeting. However, it's clear that the G7 wanted to gloss over the situation. In the joint statement released after the meeting, all the countries downplayed the trade tensions triggered by US tariffs. Trade was only mentioned once, and tariffs were not brought up at all. In reality, many officials wanted to discuss tariffs with the US, and at one point, the EU pushed for the statement to include stronger language to reflect the negative impact caused by US tariffs. I noticed that U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen was unusually low-key this time, basically avoiding making any public statements. According to U.S. officials, Yellen and other officials privately raised the idea of a unified tariff policy on China, attempting to join forces with allies to put pressure on China, but this was not formally discussed at the meeting. Reuters reported on May 22 that disagreements caused by U.S. tariff policy, as well as the U.S. reluctance to label the Russia-Ukraine conflict as illegal, were significant issues. There had been doubts from the outside world about whether a final joint statement would be reached. In the end, after 3 days of talks, the participants signed a lengthy statement which removed previous language regarding addressing climate change and also softened the wording about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The Huaiji Daily took note of this. The wording of the statement was rather vague, revealing almost no details of the discussions or the commitments made by each country on trade issues. Although trade was a central focus of the closed-door discussions, the statement only mentioned the word trade once, and the topic of tariffs was not addressed. According to reports, delegates, including the G7 central bank governor, acknowledged that the negotiations faced challenges, including ongoing disagreements among countries over tariff issues. But in the end, the joint statement overlooked this point and merely stated that the G7 is committed to maintaining economic security and resilience through a balanced and rapid growth macroeconomic policy mix, ensuring that all citizens share in the benefits of development. The statement said that at the last meeting of international organizations, it was pointed out that uncertainty in trade and economic policies remains high and is dragging down global economic growth. We know that economic policy uncertainty has receded from its peak and that joint efforts will drive further progress. The statement also did not mention China, but a US official commented off the record. Did the G7 hold closed-door discussions on how to jointly respond to the impact of what they call China's unfair trade practices? An official also said that one of the options privately discussed by Bessent and other US officials was a unified tariff policy, that is, the US and its allies would jointly implement a new coordinated trade policy against China to increase pressure. However, this is only a preliminary idea. It is still under discussion within the Trump administration and was not brought up at the meeting. A spokesperson for the U.S. Treasury Department declined to comment on the unified tariff policy. At the press conference, Canadian Finance Minister Bill Morneau also refused to disclose specific details on how the G7 plans to address the issue of global trade imbalances, saying only that the joint statement sends a strong signal. As for why the statement almost completely ignored trade and tariff issues, the only way to barely explain it is to say that the ministers of each country did not actually avoid the issue. Tariffs are an unavoidable topic of discussion. It's just that the wording is an art in its. What's important is that all countries reach a common position. The document is clear in its objectives and focuses on action. However, at the closing press conference, Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem said, "It's obvious that we are all paying close attention to the issue of tariffs." Although the joint statement emphasized that we are pleased to see a decrease in uncertainty, it is clear that there is still a lot of work to be done. Reuters noted that Yellen was previously absent. The G20 finance ministers meeting was held in South Africa. Her participation in the G7 meeting this time brought relief to many attendees, but as the U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen's demeanor at the meeting was unusually low-key. She did not hold any press conferences and basically stayed out of the media spotlight. On the 20th Honest, Yellen told a reporter, "I had a very productive day." This was her only public comment to the media during the meeting. It wasn't until the meeting concluded, as Yellen was leaving Banff, that she said there were no major disagreements among the G7 countries and that the meeting went very smoothly. A European official attending the meeting told the Wall Street Journal that many G7 officials wanted to discuss tariff issues with Yellen. Valdis Dombrovskis, the European Commission's Commissioner for Economic Affairs, said that although the talks were generally friendly, the EU was privately pushing for the final G7 statement to include stronger language to reflect the negative impact of US trade policy on the global economy. U.S. officials said that Yellen privately urged the EU to significantly reduce or even eliminate the digital services tax as a condition for accelerating U.S.-EU trade negotiations. France, Italy, the UK, and others currently impose this type of tax on foreign tech companies providing services within their borders. The U.S. has accused this policy of constituting unfair trade. Canada's digital tax has also become a focal point of debate between the US and Canada. The White House warned in February that it might impose retaliatory tariffs because of this. On issues related to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Yellen also privately told European officials that the US is willing to increase sanctions against Russia to force Russia to negotiate with Ukraine. Ukraine's Finance Minister Marchenko attended this meeting. According to US and European officials, during the meeting, G7 representatives agreed to consider imposing new sanctions on Russia as an option, especially regarding this matter. Rovskis, an official from the eastern sector, said that G7 finance ministers are discussing a proposal to further lower the price cap on Russian crude oil. A European official said that the reason this plan was not mentioned in the joint statement is partly because Yellen believes it is unnecessary. The United States does not agree with the proposal to lower the price cap on Russian crude oil. To put it simply, the G7 series of meetings have always been led by the United States, whether it's the summit, the foreign ministers meeting, or the finance ministers meeting. In recent years, their post-meeting statements have consistently included sections targeting China. For example, after last year's finance ministers and central bank governors meeting, the statement mentioned China several times. It discussed re-establishing a constructive, stable relationship with China and expressed concern over the so-called issue of Chinese overcapacity distorting the market, harming G7 workers, industries, economic resilience, and security. Although last year's statement emphasized there was no intention to decouple from China. They also stated that they had no intention of harming or hindering China's economic development, but said they would seek to address unfair business practices and continue to take action to ensure a fair competitive environment for their own companies. They also called on China not to implement export control measures. A year has passed, so what is the global situation now? Trump has been wielding tariffs against the world, and China is the only country bold enough to stand up and respond with reciprocal countermeasures. As a result, the international landscape has clearly changed. Looking back at last year's finance ministers' meeting, the criticism of China in the official statement was just a passing mention. Bringing up the language used last year now is truly ironic. First of all, the country that is currently distorting the market and harming the workers, industries, economic resilience, and security of the G7 group apart from the United States is not China, but the United States itself. If the G7 wants to address unfair business practices and continue to take action to protect their own companies, this is exactly what the United States is currently pushing for, except it's only about protecting American companies. As for Trump's approach, it was to achieve this goal by harming not only companies from the other 6 countries, but businesses around the world. Third, last year, the G7 called on China not to implement export control measures. Compared to last year, China is now enforcing even stricter export controls on strategic resources. This isn't just aimed at the US, Japanese, and European car companies have also expressed concerns that their stockpiles of rare earths might not be sufficient. But this year, the G7 finance ministers didn't even dare to bring up the 4th point. What's worth noting is that the US wanted to hold a closed-door meeting, during which it proposed that the G7 should implement a unified tariff policy against China. It's believed that this would be quite difficult to carry out. Does this mean the US would exempt the other 6 countries from tariffs? Now, even allies in the G7 face additional US tariffs, so why would they go to war with China for the US? That's not necessarily the case. Do the other 6 countries even have the strength to fight a tariff war with China? As the US truly begins to feel the pain of a tariff war with China, what about China? China's tough counterattack has also made the West see China in a new light. Recently, the Wall Street Journal quoted the views of Guy Debelle, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, which reflects how the West is re-evaluating its understanding of China. In April, Debelle visited China at a time when US President Trump was launching so-called reciprocal tariffs and ultimately set the tariff rates on China at an extremely exaggerated level. As a result, the international community was very concerned about the state of China's economy and whether it would be affected, and Australia was no exception. When meeting with Chinese business leaders, he found that they were generally confident that China could gain the upper hand in the trade war. They also widely believed that this was due to the impact of the country's fiscal stimulus policies. The economic situation had already begun to improve in January. In addition, House found that the Chinese people he interacted with generally believed that the government was capable of achieving the roughly 5% economic growth target. As for the impact of US policies on China, House discovered that most Chinese people expected that the actual cost of US tariffs would ultimately be borne by the United States itself. Moreover, the Chinese are determined not to mitigate this kind of impact. For example, if the renminbi were to depreciate significantly, the effect of U.S. Tariffs on American consumers might be greatly reduced. However, House realized that there are very few supporters of this idea in China. He said, "We found that almost no one wants China to help the U.S. avoid the impact of tariffs." What surprised me in House summary is that most Australian companies are very optimistic about the prospects of cooperating with China, and this optimism is supported by the rebound in market sentiment in China at the beginning of 2025. As well as confidence that the Chinese government will take the necessary measures to maintain economic vitality. Foreign media reports have focused on China not wanting the renminbi to depreciate, but from House remarks, we can see that Western politicians are surprised by how united China is in resisting the unfair suppression from the United States. How should we respond to Trump's kind of extortionist diplomacy? Besides hard power, confidence is crucial. If you knew from the start, you won't gain respect, only more exploitation. On the contrary, standing firm can change the perspective of rational, pragmatic Western politicians.